Leaving Atari. What precipitated the last resignation from Atari for me? If spy clocks and subjugation were not enough reason to leave Atari, there were even more issues. Things were falling apart, with Time Warner calling the shots, pushing bad ideas and game designs and repeated efforts to manipulate, monitor, and control the creative and engineering geniuses that made Atari valuable in the first place. Even worse, Time Warner directed what tech that we should use, and yet they had never worked on console video games. They were so ignorant. They did not know the right tech choices or where to invest. They naively drew flawed conclusions on platform parallels that would make for bad and slow games. Most notably, they simply believed that video game console development was just like computer software development. They were very wrong. The clash of Atari and Time Warner culture was palpable, and there seemed to be no path that could satisfy both entities. Time Warner was not happy with Atari Games, and Atari Games was not happy with Time Warner. And so Time Warner decided to sell their newly formed Time Warner Interactive. Consequently, there were potential buyers of Atari passing through at times. Nolan Bushnell was one of them. He was the original founder of Atari Games. That's when I first met Nolan Bushnell in person. He came through looking to buy Atari Games. Apparently, he had big oil money from the Middle East, and he could pay all cash if the price was right. As it turned out, the price was not right. However, Nolan did not have enough cash to regain Atari by himself at the wrong price. His hopes and dreams of returning to his glory Atari days were dashed. Instead, Midway Home Entertainment bought Atari and pieced it out over time until Atari was completely gone. All that is left of Atari Games are its old games and its nostalgia, which no doubt will be capitalized on by low-quality developers and publishers churning out unimaginative, repetitive sequels like so many loser studios do. As an aside, there is a surprising coincidence involving Nolan Bushnell. Nolan employed my mother when she fixed televisions as the troubleshooter to repair reclaimed broken television sets that he would mount inside coin-operated arcade machines that he could sell into bars and later into arcades. My mother would fix the TVs in a warehouse, day in and day out, and she was paid on spec per TV that worked, or she would be paid nothing at all. She was motivated and earned a record amount of repairs and therefore money from Nolan. It's a crazy world that we live in to find out that my own mother worked for Atari Games and that she even chatted up times with Nolan Bushnell. It was wild. It's a small world. Anyway, I gained a lot of experience as an employee with hands-on coding, game design, dedicated and cross-platform engineering, team management, and interacting in what may have been the least corporate of corporations in the world. Atari was not your ordinary video game company. People regularly self-medicated with booze, recreational drugs, and adventurous behavior. It was such a dichotomy to see excess drugs and booze aside genius engineering and creativity. Truthfully, I felt I was among my kind at Atari. I may not be a drug user, but I was like them otherwise. I was naturally more like a Spock, an alien character dedicated to logic and reason above all else. But I learned talents to be like Star Trek's Kirk, a human character that leads with emotion and integrity to better engage, inspire, and work with people. Atari people were individually either extreme techie, a la Star Trek Spock, or they were over-the-top loudmouths like Star Trek Kirk. The whole company was full of Kirks and Spocks, but very few people had both Spock and Kirk traits. People were simply on the Spock Kirk spectrum, where they were placed somewhere between. People in the middle of the Spock Kirk spectrum could juggle intense hardware, software, and human challenges, but were not necessarily geniuses, or innovators, or great strategists. But they were solid contributors, as jacks of all trade positions in the middle of the spectrum. They were normal. Pure Spocks were deep hardware, firmware, architects in engineering. People on the Kirk side of the spectrum were more game leads, management engineers. They might even become producers or technical artists. The nature of the spectrum is that things are measured across its span. However, it becomes anomalous when somehow a single unit exists in two places at once. It is a sort of metric paradox. Well, I think I was such a paradox. I was so extremely Spock while also being extremely Kirk. The result is that I somehow was on both ends of the Spock-Kirk spectrum at the same time. It made me highly capable at both. I jokingly called myself Spirk, being both Spock and Kirk. I rose quickly, being seen as the Pentium processor of the era, a computer core CPU that needed to be actively cooled or it would burn itself out prematurely. The funny thing is, I actually did have a fan blowing on me non-stop, every year, every day, every hour, every minute. So was Steve Calfee right, jesting that I might burn myself out? Of course not. I was the Spirk. Let me say again, Atari was crazy. One artist lived in an RV, a recreational vehicle, in the back parking lot, catching the California sun on its roof during hot days. That's right, he put a lounge chair on the roof. He was loose with dating, and so had frequent dalliances with numerous partners. It was obvious because, well, he lived in our parking lot. One unhappy girlfriend ran him down one time in that very parking lot. He actually had to go to the hospital. In another story about another artist named Manuel Laguitan, who went by the name Manny. Well, he blackmailed the company, and another time had his nose broken by an angry engineer when both were using cocaine and arguing over San Francisco Rush car art design. An engineer on another case bought a yellow Lamborghini Countach, but he mounted a kitchen faucet as its hood ornament. He declared the water faucet on a multi-$100,000 car showed everyone how truly successful he was. It showed everyone that he was great. Well, I thought it actually showed everyone that he was insecure and that he had money to waste. It made him a target, I felt, for any loose gold-digging woman because he flaunted his excess and apparent inability to manage his money. So I would figure for a gold digger, that's exactly what they wanted. But knowing the engineer, I think he wanted the gold diggers too, so maybe it was a match made in heaven. Engineers and artists and producers fought frequently verbally within Atari. Some even resorted to fistfights though, and sometimes there were all-out brawls. Emotions ran high in Atari, especially when people were drunk or high on drugs, which was much more often than people might want to admit or imagine. Atari games had off-site creative sessions and pitches for off-site events. However, they also provided at most of these events drugs and booze in remote locations, like beach hotels. The recreational drugs and booze were intended to stimulate imagination and encourage socialization. Offsites often ended with police and behind-the-scenes settlements. One such offsite incident was an engineer stealing a nearby home's child motocross bicycle, and he rode it into the hotel and across its halls, and ultimately into its pool. He was arrested, but Atari hired a lawyer for him, paid his fines, his court fees, and they settled with the plaintiffs whose kid had his bike stolen by an Atari dude. It was all very silly stuff, and while criminal, it wasn't big crime, but that was Atari's culture, wild, creative, and unaccountable. Before Dan Van Alderen took over from Hide Nakajima as president of Atari Games, coin-op was on the decline already from all of its excesses and declining market. Hide called a company-wide meeting to discuss Atari's performance as an organization spanning the consumer and coin-operated games. Hide first praised the great history of Atari, and he extolled the greatness of the people that made it great. Yes, he had a lot of greats, but he was sincere, and he made his points very clear, despite English being his second language. He was Japanese speaking natively. He paused and then said in a deep and solemn voice, "We must hang our heads in shame. We have not kept Atari what it was. We are not selling as many games as we did. We must be better. We must do better. Atari depends on us." Atari was its own person, I think, to Hide. It was more than a corporate entity. Atari was the spirit of games and creativity and of passion. But Atari was struggling. Coin-op arcade games were not earning the quarters they had anymore. Consumer games had issues with Nintendo litigation and transitions to new generation video game consoles. It was a tough time for Atari games. But it was surreal to have a Japanese-style shame meeting. Just like Atari had its crazy culture, Hide Nakajima had cultural influences from his native Japan as well. Even so, it was weird to me, like out of a television show. I remembered a movie, Gung Ho, in 1986 that showcased a similar idea of American versus Japanese work cultures clashing, resulting from Japanese car company in that case buying an American car company and imposing Japanese cultures and expectations onto the American cultures and expectations. So I lived the Gung Ho movie experience that day with Hide's Day of Shame at Atari Games.